I mean, it's really important to affirm the differences there are between faiths in terms of tradition, in terms of practice, in terms of theology, but at the mystic level, which is purely about the direct relationship of the individual, of the community with the divine. That, for me, is mysticism. We're not talking about ecstatic states. We're talking about that direct relationship.
What if spirituality didn't ask you to sign up to a set of beliefs, but invited you to listen and to act? Today, I'm going to be speaking to Jennifer Kavanagh, a writer, a Quaker, and a spiritual activist, about what makes the Quaker Way so radically open and yet so rooted in something real. If you're feeling spiritually disillusioned, in between traditions, or just wondering what a community of spiritual seekers might look like, then this conversation's just for you. Let's go. Well, Jennifer, thank you very much for joining us for this episode of Quakerism. I think the first thing, obviously, we want to talk about and get going with this is to talk about maybe your spiritual background. And you've spoken and talked a lot about the Quaker Way, for example, but also your Jewish heritage and your multi-faith background. How do you describe your spiritual identity?
Just as Quaker. I don't get more complicated than that. And I don't define myself as a Christian, because I guess I would call myself a Universalist in that I feel that Quaker can encompass it all. And part of the reason for that, as you mentioned, my multi-faith background. My mother was a non-practicing Jew. My father initially was Anglican, so I was baptized Anglican. And in fact, I was confirmed as an Anglican, and I was quite a religious little girl. And I sang in the church choir and all that. And then at 18, I think as so often happens, it all went underground. I used to say I lost my faith, but someone corrected me and said, no, it just went underground. I think that's right. So for about 30 years, I didn't practice any faith. And then in the wake of trauma, again, quite a cliche, when my marriage broke up and my daughter was diagnosed with a serious illness, I cracked open and was able to access another dimension. The way that happened was I would burst into tears every time I went into a church for a christening or to look at the architecture. I didn't know what on earth was happening. And so, but I had no choice but to pursue it. And so I tried various churches and none of them worked for me. And then I remembered seeing the sign outside the Quaker Meeting House in St. Martin's Lane in London and thought I'll give it a try. And I crept in and found peace. And I rushed out. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't talk to anyone for some weeks. I think they were very, very kind to me, friends, that they accepted the fact that I was creeping in and rushing out. But it was all too tender, too strange. It's a new world. I didn't know what was happening, but I borrowed books from the library and thought I couldn't believe what I was reading. I thought I didn't know religion could be like this. This is me. And so I found I was enabled to be myself. In fact, I was required to be myself, which is, of course, not an easy thing.
You said, oh, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think, I think it's a cliche because it's true. I think when things like that happen, we need something external. We can't work it out all by ourselves. And I think it's that realization. And I think the modern world does its best to try and show that actually all we need is ourselves. But I think that's not true. And I think although I think that is a common story of an event, I had one myself where something happens where you can't deal with it by yourself and you need something above you, not like that, but like outside of you in order to deal with it. When you said that you when you were reading about Quakerism, you said, oh, this is me. What was it in particular that made you think that?
I think it was perhaps the understanding that it was about experience, that it wasn't about depending on an authority.
You open a Quaker theological book, it's not like reading others. There's no presumptions, I suppose, as well. Like I feel like when I do these videos, it's similar. I think we have to start with the spiritual journey because we can't just start talking about what Quakerism is or whatever, because we need to understand the journey that gets us there in a way that, you know, on a Catholic podcast or whatever, they can just get cracking on whatever they want to talk about, because there's all these presumed assumptions as to what people believe. I use the word Quakerism there, but when we just before recording, we talked about how these isms you don't particularly like. You prefer the idea of a Quaker way. Do you want to maybe talk about what you mean by a Quaker way and why you hold to that?
I suppose I just dislike isms because they feel to me very sort of heady. But Quaker Way, it isn't just, I was going to say it isn't just the faith, of course it is, but it includes how we are, what we do, in the same way that in a meeting for worship, we're not just sitting there on our cushions, so to speak. We are opening ourselves for guidance. It is about being guided as to what to do in our lives, and that is very much part of what being a Quaker is. So it is a way.
Yeah, I think it links with this. I did a video recently on basically starting an idea of how to promote Quakerism, and I looked at the idea of whether Quakerism is a faith, a way, or a religion, all of those sorts. And it was way that I actually thought was the best to describe it, because there's a sense of movement as well, that you can go on a journey with Quakerism, and Quakerism can inform and lead you on that journey, but that it's not necessarily it's not a static thing, like with other denominations and stuff, which have certain set beliefs, which once you believe those, once you reach that sense of understanding, then that's you just march on and do your thing. Whereas in Quakerism, there's this constant thinking, searching. Even once you've found Quakers, there's further searching. I often say that I'm not the same Quaker that I was when I started coming, and I'm guessing that must be similar to you. Does that make? Do you agree with that?
Yes. Well, to some extent, I'm not a great explorer. I actually think I waited an awfully long time to find Quakers, and it sort of fell into place. But the idea of things changing, moving, certainly. I mean, when I first came to Quakers, I couldn't say the word God because it was too full of the old man in the sky. But now I have moved on, and God is probably my word of choice, along with spirit. So, you know, who knows where I might have moved in a year or two. I just don't know, and that's fine.
Yeah, it is fine, and I think also Quakerism gives the space for that. Whereas obviously, if you were in any denomination, you'd have to use the word God, and the word God would be used all around. Whereas this more flexible language that Quakers have, it allows for a certain amount of reordering, reimagining, rethinking of words which maybe in the past we'd considered maybe unhelpful or hurtful, maybe even on the worst end of it. So without a creed, then, so we've mentioned this, that Quakers don't have a fixed doctrine. And so what do Quakers have in common then, if we don't actually believe the same thing necessarily? What do you think?
Well, I get very cross when people sort of describe us a kind of pick and mix and anything goes kind of religion, because it absolutely isn't. There are things we absolutely hold in common, which is that there is that every person in the world has the capability of direct access to the divine, that we are interconnected and with other beings, that there is continuing revelation, which I've just mentioned, that there's no division between the sacred and the secular. Everything is sacred. And without a separated priesthood, we call ourselves the priesthood of all believers, which I love. And that throws responsibility onto us. It's a very important aspect of Quakers, that we take responsibility for our own faith, for our organisation, for our finances, and by implication for the world, that we don't rely on experts and politicians to do it all. We have responsibility for what goes on in the world. And that, I think, is why Quakers have been so socially active over the centuries. And also, as I said before, when we're sitting in a Quaker meeting, we are waiting to be guided. And as to how we should behave in the world. And one important thing I missed out is our values, what ways we live our lives. So compassion, and equality and sustainability. I mean, all these things that we hold very much in common. Also, I think what people often don't get, I'm sort of changing the subject rather, but when people ask what's the difference between meditation and Quakers, because very often they think it's much the same thing. One of the things I say is that it's something we do together, that it's, I think of a meeting for worship as, well, it's a meeting to begin with. So there's this, it's like a triangle. It's the self, the divine, and the others in the room. And then when we go out into the world, we take that triangle with us because our guidance might come directly from the divine or might come very often, and usually for me, comes through other people, synchronicities that come through other people.
You mentioned divine revelation in when you were talking just earlier. What does that mean for you, and how does that affect a Quaker meeting?
Two separate questions, really. What's it mean for me? It means those nudges and openings that come unsolicited, grace. I mentioned the word synchronicity. It's a really important thing for me. Much of my life is guided by that. I know that I'm on the right path if there's a whole series of things that confirm it, which are out of the blue and extraordinary. And, I've had one or two in the past week. I mean, it is a wonderful thing. What we're doing in a meeting is connecting. And, if you were talking in a secular and rather superficial way, you'd say it was telepathy. But so often someone will rise and say something that is on your heart. And I'm no longer surprised at it. I mean, it is what happens because we are meeting in our gathering, and that's what we're doing. I remember a member of my meeting who was over 100, and her hearing had more or less gone, and I ministered, and she called me over at the end and said, "I've no idea what you said, but what I was thinking was," and it was the same.
A quote that when we've been emailing before we met online, and one phrase that you mentioned was came from a quote from William Penn, and that's the phrase "diverse liveries," which I understand as a concept of what it means, but I'm interested to see what you think that means in this idea of the universality of the Quaker Way.
It's in Quaker Faith and Practice, and William Penn wrote it in 1693. The humble, meek, merciful, just, pious, and devout souls are everywhere of one religion, and when death has taken off the mask, they will know one another, though the diverse liveries they wear here makes them strangers. And it's extraordinary that was understood in the 17th century.
Yes. William Penn does seem to be one of these early friends who I think really got this universalist aspect of that. Why is that quite important to you in terms of, and then maybe how you see the universalist side of the Quaker Way?
Well, it means a lot to me because of my background. When I found Quakers, I discovered to my delight that my parents, although they had different labels, were in the same place. Because what I hadn't mentioned is that my father became a Catholic when I was 5, and my mother discovered the Kabbalah, the mystic end of Judaism, in her 50s. So they each had their discoveries, and then I had mine. And I found we were reading the same books.
And so how do you think that then relates with Quakerism is often said to be rooted in Christianity? How does that relate to your understanding of universalism within Quakers?
Okay, but the other half of that saying is open to new light, which is what William Penn was writing about. And since his day, of course, we've had far more light to be open to because we're much more aware of other faiths. We've got this sort of global communication. And so we're much more aware and in contact with people of other faiths. And when I was traveling, and when I spent time in India, and I could see the commonality for contemporary Hinduism and Quakers, and Buddhists, of course. So there's a huge commonality at the mystic level. I mean, it's really important to affirm the differences there are between faiths in terms of tradition, in terms of practice, in terms of theology, but at the mystic level, which is purely about the relationship, the direct relationship of the individual or the community with the divine. That, for me, is mysticism. We're not talking about ecstatic states. We're talking about that direct relationship.
I've been rereading The Advices and Queries in the past week, and every time I reread it, I'm always quite astounded at how Christian that language is. And I know we're going to be maybe talking about Quaker Faith and Practice and the revising of that in a moment, but how does that, because that might be the only thing that most Quakers, or even newcomers to Quakers, might actually read, and that's a very Christian text. What would you say to people who maybe don't feel that language really resonates with them?
Well, it doesn't necessarily resonate with me either, but it's not a problem. Other people's the way other people see their faith is not a problem for me. And I accept that was written when it was written, and that it is still very true for many friends. It's important to recognise that. And actually, it's only a few of the advices and queries which mention that. The rest are different topics, more general or whatever. Other faiths accept Jesus as a teacher. Islam and so on. So, I mean, it's not specifically Christian necessarily.
I find this really interesting because I haven't had so many Quakers that would describe themselves as universalists on the channel as exist, which I know there are an awful lot. So I'm quite excited to maybe talk about why that aspect of Quakerism really appeals to you, and maybe appeals to people who are watching as well. We've got lots of people who would call themselves maybe Quaker adjacent, Quaker curious. So why might they be interested in a more universalist understanding of Quakerism than a Christian one?
In a way, I'm sorry that a distinction is made. And I haven't joined the Universalist group. I don't feel the need to, any more than I feel the need to call myself a Christian, because I feel that being a Quaker encompasses it all. And it's certainly not to deny anything about Christianity. It's quite the opposite. It's an inclusive thing, not denying anything about anybody else's. I mean, I'm just thrilled to have found something that I feel encompasses possibly my parents' viewpoint, as well as my own, and all the people that I've met. We are meeting each other in that which is eternal.
It's that sort of that meeting on equal footing, that simplicity of it as well. Instead of like you were talking about at the beginning with all these isms and stuff, it kind of removes the need for that. And we're actually at this point where we are in contact and communing with something beyond us, and we're doing that together.
There's a spectrum of belief among Quakers. I don't accept the duality of theist and non-theist, but I know that there are people who struggle with the theist position. If someone calls themselves an atheist, I say, who is this God you don't believe in? Because I probably don't believe in him either. I think we all, I can't speak for other people, but generally speaking, we have this sense of something both within us and beyond us that we cannot define, that we simply can't imagine the enormity of. And some people may talk about the universe, or some people may talk about a power, or they may have a more personal understanding of the divine. And I think that's fine. I mean, we all have different experiences. Basically, what's important about Quakes is it's an experience-based faith. If we're true to our experience, then we can be understanding of other people's experience. It absolutely isn't that anything goes. We're all relating to something mysterious. I think mystery is very much at the heart of it.
The people that you talk to about who've been to Quakers for a long time and stuff, they will talk about their first meeting and the excitement that they felt. And early friends were the same. They felt that they were encountering something which they couldn't encounter anywhere else, that they hadn't encountered before, and they kept coming. And however they're describing that it's that excitement and that connection to something new, something that maybe has been there all the time, but you just haven't really accessed. That is actually something that's so exciting to people, and that brings them back, and that they feel they experience best with friends.
Well, one of the reasons I'm pleased I wasn't born into Quakers is that I had the chance to discover it. And so I do remember the excitement. Absolutely. I couldn't believe it. And so when we have newcomers, which we do a great deal at my meeting, we have lots and lots of people coming. I'm able to share in their excitement. I'm able to understand where they're coming from and discuss things at that level. And yes, I think if I'd been born into it, I might take it more for granted.
I've got two of your books, as I said, but I was just wanting to bring up Practical Mystics a little bit, because I thought it was a really interesting title. So it goes Practical Mystics, Quaker Faith in Action. What do you mean by Practical Mystics? Obviously, I know I've read the books, but to discuss. And how do you see that this idea of mysticism and action fit together?
Yes, seemingly very disparate ideas. It was Rufus Jones who first applied it, the American Quaker, who first applied it to Quakers, although it was an Anglican, Evelyn Underhill, who first talked about practical mysticism. Well, first of all, to debunk mysticism a bit, which I did mention earlier, I'm not talking about ecstatic states or peak experiences, which we may have once or twice in our lives if we're lucky. I'm talking about that connection with the divine that we feel everybody has the opportunity to have. And maybe we feel the word mystic is a bit grand for us, but the mystic experience is something that any of us can have. And what I love, I think it was Rufus Jones who said there are lots of people walking around who have no idea they're mystics, and they have no idea if their faces are shining, something like that. It's a very beautiful thing. So that's the mystic bit. The practical bit, well, two things. Firstly, that we are a very practical lot because we have to take responsibility for all that stuff, which we talked earlier.
Yeah.
And also, you could use the word practical in terms of practice. So the practice of mysticism too. But I think it is the combination of faith and action which absolutely fascinates me. And the reason why, because it's something I didn't mention right at the beginning, when I came to Friends, I didn't realize that it would involve me in getting involved in some work and action that Quakers were doing. And I had been brought up to think that poverty and injustice were all too big for us to make a difference. And I think most people think that. I think there are a lot of people who want to make a difference and feel it's just all too big, particularly at the moment, probably. But I came across people who were making a difference locally and in small ways, perhaps, but they were. And it gave me the idea, the opportunity to think that maybe there was something I could do, which was a huge thing. And it was like recapturing my youthful idealism. That was a very important aspect for me. So in a sense, faith and action came together for me right at the beginning. And that was my initial experience of Quakers. And I jumped in with both feet. I volunteered, I worked for Quakers. I got involved in all sorts of action, mostly with homeless people, but also with prisoners, and setting up microcredit programs. So for about 12 years, I was very, very active in that sort of thing.
I think one thing that Quakers, when started coming to Quakers, that really shocked me was just how much Quakers cared about things and cared about making a difference, and that you suddenly have, if in my secular life before coming to Quakers, I was like, I knew people gave to charity, sure, but I couldn't say I knew people who organized the local Pride March, or did helped out on quite a high level at this charity or locally or whatever. Suddenly I had this group of people who care very much about things, are connected with people who are doing stuff themselves. You can't help but get involved a little bit more, and you find out things about groups that you might want to get involved in.
Some people come because, like me, they had a burning spiritual need. Other people come because they've met Quakers on peace marches or on
Yeah,
Pride.
true.
So, some people know about the active aspect of Quakers before they really get involved in the spiritual.
I find the practical aspect of Quakerism harder than I do the spiritual aspect. I think the mystical aspect I find quite easy. I think that's something that comes very easily to me. The practical side of it I find harder. What would you say to maybe someone who's maybe starting to be a Quaker, or starting going to meetings, seeing that there's these things? How could they start to be involved, to start to be this practical mystic? What advice would you give?
I think that all of us are, again, on a spectrum. And there are those for whom the mystic is the more important aspect, or the easier, or, naturally. And we will be different at different times of our lives as well. It's important to notice that. I've started running a workshop called Being and Doing because I think many of us find it difficult to find the balance. The subtitle of the workshop is Finding the Balance. It's from the Bible. It's the Martha and Mary thing. And the important thing is that there's no guilt attached to either. We are where we are, and we each have our unique gifts to offer. And I get people standing on a line, and if you're too busy, stand at that end of the line, and if you haven't got enough to do, stand at that end of the line and just talk to people about it. I mean, it's a difference, obviously, between being busy and being called to action. That's very different. We can get far too busy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that idea, because I think because of our testimonyism, because that's so central to Quakerism and has been, you kind of, if you're maybe more on the busy end of that, like, I'm in a full-time job, I don't have all the time as I would like in order to do some of these things. You can feel those testimonies can feel quite burdensome, because you feel like you're not living up to them, and you think, well, am I a Quaker then? Because I can't do these things.
I prefer to talk about testimony singular, rather than to divide it up into things which are all connected. And there's a lovely piece by Harvey Gilman about testimony being, well, he says testimonies actually, but they're not optional extras, but the very fruits of faith. And the important thing about our action is that it's grounded in our faith. Otherwise, we're activists.
Yes.
So, it's grounding what we do in our faith is crucially important. And it's interesting that we have meetings for worship outside alms fairs and things like that. That's where we are in our worship.
I suppose that's what I mean, though. I mean, I feel that I like that, actually, because I with what you said about testimony versus testimonies, because it can become something that you feel like you have to sign up and tick off, like, oh, I've done my piece, I've done my equality, whatever. But then, yeah, it can be, and so I appreciate that restructuring of that. And what you're saying about that, it's the sort of the fruit of the faith, rather than a tick list. I think is good as well. I suppose it can take many forms, and this is what I'm telling myself, and that, if I'm staying true to my connection with the divine, and what the divine's telling me, that if I'm listening to that, then the fruits will be testimony, even if I'm not on a peace march outside. I mean, nothing gives me more stress, I think, than being on a protest. I think it's just not my environment at all.
Can I just say about peace marches? I don't go on them. I go on peace walks. I can't be doing with the more raucous, out there kind of protests. I can't. I mean, it's fine for people for whom it's fine, but it's not fine for me. But the peace, I went on a peace pilgrimage recently, and that we all want peace, God knows.
What's that? What is that then? So I've heard about them. I spoke with a young friend early this year who talked about peace pilgrimage. I understand that, but these peace walks in London, I don't really understand. What do you do? So peace walk. You walk in peace. Good.
Walk in silence.
Walk in silence. Okay, very Quaker. And are there signs? Are there placards? Are there
Some signs, but we were all asked to wear a white flower, whether we made it ourselves or bought one or picked one or whatever it was. So yes.
Oh, I see. That's cool. Kind of like the
white poppy that somebody
white
made.
poppy. Yeah, well, I was going to say, is it the same as the white poppy, which is a whole different matter? But yes, definitely something I know that Quakers hold quite dear. And so, what was that like to do for someone who maybe isn't in for the big loud ruckus kind of protest? What did you experience in that setting?
The power of silence in an incredibly busy world, taking a message out to the world of something that mattered. I don't know if you took part in at yearly meeting, we linked hands round friend's house with cards with Quakers for Peace. It was a very similar feeling with terrific support from passers-by.
In London, obviously, there are protests relatively often, especially if you live or work around the Westminster area. That must be something quite different to see as well, and so therefore attracts attention, curiosity, and probably support as well. I can imagine, if you're used to more ruckus, as we saying. Kind of marches and stuff, that must be, oh, thank goodness for that. That's a lot, and actually is more in line with peace as well, because we're not necessarily out there to create noise, to create dissonance. So Quaker Quakes then. So both your books. So I've got Do Quakers Pray and Practical Mystics, both part of the Quaker Quakes series. Now I know that you that this was something that you were drawn to in terms of its very early days and so on. So I was just wondering if you just maybe talk about what led you there and why and how.
Well, I've been with these publishers for a long time. For nearly all my books have been published by them. And in the early days, it was run by John Hunt, who then retired. But I had a conversation with John Hunt. He said, we've got this series called Pagan Portals. We'd like to do the same for Quakers. What do you think? I said, wonderful, let's do it.
Yeah.
And he asked me if I would be the series editor. And I said, no, done publishing, that's my past. But I said, I'll find you some writers. So I found some writers who had a track record that would mean it could get started positive way. And then I wrote one myself, which was Practical Mystics. I love the idea. I think we've now got, over 25.
So many. I thought I thought I had a good handle over all of. I mean, I'm slowly getting my collection. They sort of gone so far, but when I was at the library, when I was at the bookshop at a friend's house, I was astounded. There was some that I'd never even heard of that were on there.
The point is, it's a commercial publisher that is, it's not being published by Quakers. It's a commercial publisher that happens to like Quakers, that is selling worldwide in English, and they are for Quakers, but also very much for people who want to find out more about Quakers. So they're only 20,000 words long, and you have to be careful not to mention acronyms or jargon that people won't understand without explaining it. So you don't use the word without explaining it, for instance. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I mean, they've been very helpful for me in terms of, because the titles are very simple. They're not very intimidating as books, but I find that the ones that I've read, that they really get to quite a deep space quite quickly, and it just allows different aspects of Quakerism to be really focused in and honed in on. So, like, for example, Do Quakers Pray? You've dedicated an entire Quaker Quake on that question, and I've done a review of that, and I thought that was very helpful to make me think about whether or not I prayed. At the beginning of the book, I was like, I don't pray, and then at the end of it, yes, I do, in fact.
The reason I wrote the book and the reason I created the prayer game earlier were because I had a problem with the word prayer. I didn't know what prayer was in a Quaker context, and I didn't know whether I prayed. And so I created the prayer game for a workshop, and someone said you should publish it. And I'd already created a board game, so I had a connection. I knew how to do that. But so I wrote one evening, I sat down and wrote 52 phrases or words that might speak of prayer. And the idea is that you try and you pick up and throw away until you've all got 4 cards that speak to you of prayer. There is a YouTube little thing about playing it.
I'll put it in the description.
It seems to work. I've sent it to Alaska. I've sent it to other faiths. It seems to work for different faiths, which is lovely. And then I felt the need to write that Do Quakers Pray.
So you picked your 4 cards, which they just have singular words. For example, what would they be? And then what would they do with them?
So each have 4 cards. It might be Dear Lord, repentance, silence, wasting time with God, a whole range. Some discipline. And on different days, you probably adhere to, be drawn to different cards. There's love. There are a couple of jokers, so you can make them whatever you want them to do. So you pick one up and you throw one away, and then the next person can either pick up the one you've thrown away or take one from the top. And then when everyone's happy with the 4 that they've got, you lay them down and you discuss what you've got those 4. And those discussions really can be quite profound. It's a way of discussing things we very rarely discuss. I mean, it only takes about 20 minutes. And the people I played it first with at yearly meeting, there were 6 friends, and they all said, I don't do prayer. And then found that it meant something to them. So, I'm delighted, really.
I know, obviously, you've got a new book out this year, which is a bit different. You want to maybe talk about what that's about and your experiences writing it, maybe?
Yes, it's called Thread of Life, my Russian Legacy. It ought really to have been called My Russian and Jewish Legacy, but I can't remember why I was persuaded into leaving it out. But anyway, there we are. So my mother was Russian. My grandmother died in the Holocaust. My grandfather was born in the Ukraine. But basically, I felt, I don't know, a sort of series of things over the years led to me feeling that I wanted to honour the memory of my grandmother, whom I never met. But my mother adored her and said what a artistic and gentle and lovely person she was. And so I wanted to honour her memory. And so it turned into a kind of history of the 20th century through 2 women, my grandmother Dora and my mother Zhenya, because my mother lived to 102, and was born in the First World Wars. It encompassed from 1915 right through to a few years ago when she died. So war and peace in various parts of the world. And the Gaza horrors hadn't started then, but while I was a few months into writing it, she invaded Ukraine, and I did stop. Think, what do I do, and then I did realise this was simply another war after all these other wars. So, I continued. I recorded an interview with my mother when she was 95, and so I had that as a basis, and then there were letters from relations and so on. So the research was interesting and sometimes very painful. I sat in the British Library reading a book called The Riga Holocaust, and there was a voice over the tannoy saying there will now be a 2-minute silence. And I hadn't realised it was Armistice Day, and I was reading this book. That was one of those synchronicities. But the mysteries of memory, divergent memories of the same thing, my mother told different versions of things, that was all fascinating. So I looked at their legacy to me in all sorts of ways, in terms of music and literature and Jewishness, I discuss anti-Semitism, and actually I can just show a postcard of it. I'll just get it.
There we are. And I will also put a link to that in the description as well.
The launch was lovely in that people from all parts of my life came, and including two people who were very close to my mother before she died, her carer and her pharmacist. And so it was a kind of, recapturing of that time.
So with the Jewishness that you felt and reconnected with in the process of this book, how do you see that aspect of your life and the Quaker Way? What are your thoughts on those two sides?
They have a lot in common in that they have both been persecuted. Quakers in the past and Jews forever. And interestingly, in the early days, Margaret Fell and other Quakers worked towards getting the Jews accepted back in England when they'd been expelled. So, there were connections. But spiritually speaking, there's a mystic end to Jewishness that I do relate to. Not the Kabbalah, which for me is very complicated, and but the Hasidim, the early Hasidim, which Martin Buber writes about, is incredibly profound spiritually, and I do relate to that. I have to say that writing a book like this at this time, the Russians and the Jews are not the most popular people in the world, and writing about this past is not to affirm anything that's going on. I mean, it's deeply, deeply shocking on both fronts. And it's so important not to conflate Jews with Israel, or indeed even Israel with its current government. There are a lot of people in Israel itself who are fighting like mad to try and change things. Yes. So, and as far as Russia's concerned, it has a very beautiful artistic past, and the BBC correspondent in Russia writes very beautifully about hoping Russia will recover its heart and its romantic past.
Yeah, I can imagine those elements, obviously, in terms of feeding into this story in the publication of it in this environment. It must bring a lot of things together, sometimes quite painful ones. But I think, as I said, I will make sure there's a description for a link in the description for the book, and that will be on my next next Christmas list probably, I think, and I will get that one then. Can we talk a bit about how the revision of Faith and Practice is going? I know it's a bit of a tangent, but I'm rather interested. Obviously, I'm not sure if there are things you can't say or anything, but Faith and Practice is our book of discipline, it's called, but doesn't mean like it's a set of rules or anything. So maybe start there. What is it? What is Faith and Practice?
Okay.
Why are we editing it? What's that like?
Quaker Faith and Practice is a collection it's an anthology of writings from the beginnings of Quakers to the present day. And it also includes some constitutional stuff about how to do things. Because we believe in continuing revelation, as we've said earlier, we revise it. It's not set in stone. It's very important that it's not a holy book in the way that others are. We revise it every generation, which is about every 30 years. A yearly meeting asked us to revise it, and a committee of about 25 people was set up 6.5 years ago. And we're still at it, and we hope to finish in another couple of years. In fact, we're pulling together the whole thing of what we've written and anthology material, and hoping to have a first draft, very much a first draft, by next March to take to publications department for them to edit and put into house style and all that sort of stuff. It'll then be presented to yearly meeting. Of course, we've got continuing yearly meetings now, so I can't remember when it is. Anyway, so then yearly meeting will suggest changes, and people will have had opportunities to read it in their meetings and discuss it in their meetings and so on. It'll come back to us, and then we'll do some alterations, and then hopefully it'll be published 2029 or so.
I'm just curious about many things, really. I think maybe first question is why. So it started 6 years ago. It should be ready by 2029. If we're looking at like a usual book publication, that's a long time. What is it about faith and practice that means that it's taking the time that it takes?
Because we're not revising it, we are redoing it. We started from scratch, and we looked at what our principles were, what our readership is, what the topic should be, how we're going to do it for the next generation. A lot of that will be online, of course. And we were
Yeah.
asked specifically by Yearly Meeting to concentrate on core stuff for a printed book so that that would not change. And then supplementary material for the things that might change, like we had an extra little book on marriage when we got same-sex marriage. You know, there will be things that will change. So the detail we're trying to keep separate from core principles and why we do things, and most of all grounded in the spirit. And the structure, the people working on structure have come up with this wonderful image of a tree with all the branches, which is how we're structuring it.
How different are we going to be expecting it to be in terms of compared to the book that we are currently using?
Well, I think there will be a lot that's different. I mean, we need to include stuff on online worship. We have more on the theist, non-theist parameters, all of that. We want to have stuff from children. We want to have young people's voices. We want to have contemporary voices as well as all the voices from the past. And we're not going to do away with William Penn and George Fox or with Caroline Stevens or, you know, a lot of these beloved, you know, there's a list of much loved phrases that, you know.
Definitely. I think that's really nice. I think it's good that we change it. I think it's nice that we have that as you say, it's a moving document, that it's something that we can make our own for, that speaks to friends of this generation. I think it speaks well to continuing revelation and all those sorts of things.
We have a group that specifically looks at involving friends in it, and all Quakers there's a submission tool on the Quaker Faith and Practice page, so people can submit things still that they want to be included or that they don't want lost or whatever, and that includes non-text anthology. We're looking at illustration, we're looking at art. For online, we're looking for you know, possibly music and videos and podcasts and all sorts of stuff. So,
oh, really?
Yes.
Gosh, I didn't know who was going to do all that. That's really cool.
So you need to.
I'll put the link in the description as well for people that might want to do that didn't know. What have been some of the challenges maybe of that?
Oh, huge challenges. I mean, it's a lot of work, as you can imagine. We are, importantly, we are supposed to be a cross-section of the Quakers in Britain in terms of our diversity, diversity theologically and in terms of age and you know, ability, physical and mental and so on, so, and background. So we're bound to have differences in our little groups when we get into little groups to discuss topics and so on. But and one of the difficulties has been that we're not able to meet in person all the time, because after COVID it was ruled too expensive to send us all off to one place or another. So we do it twice a year, and they're precious times. We've just had one in Leeds, so mostly it's on Zoom.
I can imagine some of the challenges that must be, but I think that's it's all into hopefully leading to results, which sounds really fascinating and sounds more multifaceted than I think I actually realized it was going to be, with all these different media being put out there. I think that leads quite nicely to my last question, is about how do you see Quakerism going forward? What do you think the future of Quakerism is? Are you hopeful about it? What are your thoughts?
I believe that if the spirit needs us, we will be there. And I do think that we are needed. I think our voice is very much needed in the world.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much for for coming on and talking to us here on Quaker Up. It's been really cool, and thank you very much as well for coming in and saying hello at yearly meeting and setting all this whole thing up. I think that was really cool.
Thank you for asking me. It's been a privilege.
Listeners, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. See you then.
Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.